next up, we're talking about calculating with sig figs. So when it comes to calculating with significant figures here, keep in mind significant figures to help us determine in terms of like numbers, just how many digits are included. And so I know so far when we've been doing calculations, we've had a couple questions with regards to like where we should round. And so after this, we shouldn't have any sort of questions with regards to rounding. Now, when we're talking about doing calculations and rounding, there are different rules depending on whether we're talking about adding and subtracting or multiplying and dividing. Now, when it comes to adding and subtracting, the rule is whenever you add or subtract, you use the least number of decimal places. And so when we're talking about the least number of decimal places, basically it doesn't matter what you get out of your calculator, you just focus on the decimal places in your original numbers. And then that helps determine the number of decimal places you should use in your rounded answer, which is kind of like our final answer. So with that in mind, let's look at an example. And so for our first example, we have 2.25 plus 1.9. So we take our 2.25, we add it to our 1.9, and we do this just like normal. So we don't change these numbers as we plug it into our calculator. So we plug these into our calculator, and we end up getting 4.15 in our calculator. Now we go back to the original numbers, 2.25 and 1.9. And we see that the 1.9 only has one decimal place, which means our final answer should only have one decimal place. So our final answer can only have one decimal place, meaning the 1. And as we look, we check the very next digit. So we look at the 5, and we ask ourselves, okay, well, does the 5 cause the 1 to round up or down? Well, since it's a 5, it's going to cause it to round up, which means our final answer here should be 4.2. All right, let's look at our next one. So 34.2 minus 15. We plug it into our calculator. We get 19.2 out of the calculator. And then in this case, we go back to our original numbers again. We see that 15 has no decimals. So in this case, our final answer should have no decimal places. So because 19.2 should have no decimal places, we just lop off the 0.2, giving us 19 as the final answer. Okay, so when it comes to adding and subtracting, the number of significant figures in our two numbers has no effect on the number of significant figures that we get as our final answer. It quite literally only depends on the number of decimal places. Okay, which I know kind of confuses or throws some students off sometimes. So remember, it really just has to do with the decimal places. Now, there is a rule, unfortunately, that does deal with the number of significant figures, and that's multiplying and dividing. And multiplying and dividing says that we do care about the number of significant figures, and we should use the least number of significant figures when it comes to multiplying and dividing. And so when we multiply and divide, we figure out which of the two numbers has the fewest number of significant figures, and it should match the fewest number of significant figures when we round our answer. So with that, let's do a couple examples. So we got 20.3 times 14. So we go through, we plug this into our calculator, and after plugging it into our calculator, we end up with, for our first answer, 284.2. Now we double check our original numbers and we see 14 here only has 2 sig figs. So our final answer should only have 2 sig figs, which means that 284 rounded to 2 significant figures. That means we keep the 2, we keep the 8, and then we ask ourselves, does the 4 round up or down? Which, since it's a 4, it's going to round down. So our final answer here becomes 280. All right, let's look at our next one. So 155 divided by 6.7. So here we're going to get 23.1343, and then, as it turns out, there's a bunch of other numbers. But because we know we're going to round, we'll just stop after 1343. And again, we look at our 2 original numbers. We see 6.7 has 2 sig figs. And so since the 6.7 is 2 sig figs, our final answer can only have 2 sig figs. So 23.1343 with some extra digits, rounded to 2 significant figures, ends up as, in this case, just 23. All right. And so let's look at some other kind of mixed examples here. And so let's do like 1 or 2 examples together. So I'll give you guys like 10 seconds, then we'll go over it. All right, remember this one is adding and subtracting, so we plug it into our calculator. This one's kind of tricky, actually. We get 7.7 out of our calculator. Now, our calculator did something funky because it doesn't know about sig figs. And in this case, because it's adding and subtracting, remember the adding and subtracting rule goes by decimals. And in this case, it says that we should have 2 decimal places because the fewest number of decimals in this case is 2. But our calculator only gave us 1, right? So, because our calculator only gave us 1, that means that we can kind of say it's like there's this invisible 0 here, right? So in this case, our rounded answer would be 7.70. All right, our next one, we got 45.6 divided by 0.028. Go ahead, punch that sucker in. Tap, 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 tap. All right, hopefully you guys also got 1628.5714 with some other numbers. And the rule should be, hopefully we agree, this time fewest sig figs, and it should be, this time, 2 sig figs. And if it's 2 sig figs, as we're looking at it, that means we should be rounding to 1,600. And then finally, our last one, give this one an attempt. Calculator says 30,300. Rule says number of sig figs should be 1 sig fig, or in this case, 30,000 as our final answer. All right, now there's one type of example that we did not actually see, and let's talk about it really quick. What happens when we have multiple things going on at once? Now, let's just say we have something like 3.25 plus 4.6 all over 5.637. Right. Now, how does this work? And every now and then we come across calculations similar to this. And if we come across a calculation like this that has just multiple steps, our way of solving this, according to at least algebra, is just following the order of operations. We should start with just simplifying the top, right? So we should start with 3.25 plus 4.6. Now, if we start with our 3.25 plus the 4.6, we are going to get 7.85 over our 5.637. Now, remember, as we go from this first part to this first part, we should round for sig figs. Now, according to the sig fig rule, from here, or from this first step to the second step, the sig fig rule says we should be going to the fewest number of decimal places, which means if we're going to the fewest number of decimal places, that means that the 7.85 here actually becomes 7.9. And then we should have 7.9 divided by our 5.637. Remember, because when we're adding, it goes by fewest decimals. So now, when we plug in 7.9 divided by our 5.637 into our calculator, we end up getting an answer 1.401, we'll just call it 4.5 with some extra digits. But here, when we're dividing, remember we switched rules, and so because we switched rules, we check sig figs again, and the multiplying dividing rule says fewest sig figs, and the fewest number of sig figs in this calculation was 2, so we should be rounding to 2 sig figs, or we should have a final answer of 1.4. All right, that is it for our video. Have a good one.